The alien scream gurgled to an abrupt stop as Samuel Miller crushed its throat, rage burning in the human's eyes at the sadistic torture he and his men had endured for days aboard the Malorn ship. Samuel's head throbbed as he regained consciousness in the dark, dank cell. His vision swam, memories flooding back, the ambush by Malon forces on that remote planet, his squad overwhelmed and captured. The blow to his head before it all went black. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw he wasn't alone. A dozen of his squad mates, stripped of weapons and gear, sat imprisoned too. The cell door opened. In walked Corvus, a tall avian-like Malon with cruel, intelligent eyes, the commander who led the ambush. He surveyed the humans with disdain. "You are now prisoners of the Malon Empire," Corvus announced, "to be interrogated and executed as enemies of the state. Cooperate, and your deaths will be quick. Resist, and you'll beg for death before the end." To demonstrate, Corvus's guards dragged one of Samuel's men out. Vicious beating sounds and agonized screams echoed from the hallway before the broken, bloody body was dumped back inside. The humans recoiled in terror at the taste of what was to come. Corvus locked eyes with Samuel. "I know you're their commander. You will be broken first. We Malon rarely get to study humans closely. I will take my time extracting every scrap of information from your mind and testing the limits of human endurance." With a cruel laugh, Corvus left them locked in the cell. Samuel and his men traded grim looks, contemplating the coming ordeals. They all knew if they broke under the ruthless alien interrogation, humanity's plans in this sector would be exposed, leading to decimation of human colonies and fleets. Samuel gritted his teeth. No matter the cost, no matter the suffering, he could not let that happen. He would have to find a way to resist the Malon and escape this ship, or die trying. The hours ran together into days as Samuel and his men were dragged out of the cell again and again for interrogation sessions with Corvus. The cruel Malon commander oversaw each one personally, his cold eyes gleaming as he watched Samuel convulse from electrocution, gag on water filling his lungs, scream as bones snapped and flesh tore. But no matter what sadistic torment Corvus inflicted, Samuel locked his jaw and refused to break, even as his body failed and his mind fractured. "I can stop this, you know," Corvus said almost gently, circling Samuel where he hung limply from chains. "Just tell me what I want to know. Earth's defenses, your colony's locations. Give me something, and I'll end your suffering." Samuel stayed silent except for his agonized, shuddering breaths. Corvus frowned and waved a talon. Agony exploded across Samuel's back as an energized whip shredded skin and muscle. He jerked and choked on his screams, sweat and blood running into his eyes, but still he held firm, anchoring himself with thoughts of home, of the billions who would suffer if he failed. "Impressive for a human," Corvus said coldly. "Take him back. Perhaps one of his men will prove more cooperative." The guards dragged Samuel down the now familiar halls, past cells where his men's hoarse cries echoed. At least they were still resisting too. At least Samuel wasn't failing them. They threw him back into the dark cell where he crumpled into a bloody heap. His remaining men crept to his side, ashen and hollow-eyed. "Still nothing?" one rasped. Samuel shook his head minutely, gritting his teeth as broken bones ground together. "Those fuckers," another hissed. "Degenerates, savages. If I could get my hands on just one of them—" The cell door crashed open. Corvus stormed in, flanked by guards, his eyes filled with rage. He seized the nearest human, hauling him up, and shoved a plasma pistol under his chin. "I'm done asking," Corvus snarled at Samuel. "You will tell me what I want to know, or I will kill your men one by one until you do." "Hursu," Samuel croaked, trying to rise. Corvus's finger tightened on the trigger. The plasma bolt seared through the man's head, obliterating it in a red mist. The corpse toppled, joining the spreading pool of blood, the echoes of the shot still ringing. Stunned silence, then a howl of grief and fury as the human surged forward, only to be beaten back by the guards. Corvus lowered his pistol, smoking, and stepped forward until he loomed over Samuel. "One every day," the Malon said with cold finality. "Until you break. or until you have no one left." Then he was gone, the cell door slamming shut with a clang of finality, leaving the humans with their horror and their dead. Samuel dragged himself upright, wiping blood from his eyes with a trembling hand. He crawled to his fallen man, reaching out to close the staring, empty eye sockets. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He looked up at the others, their faces mirrors of his own rage and pain. He died for Earth. He died fighting. Don't let that be in vain. Slowly his surviving men nodded. In low voices they began to share a glimpse of a hangar bay through a doorway, a count of Malon soldiers, snippets of conversation revealing guard schedules. Samuel listened intently, a plan starting to take shape through the red haze of agony and grief. They would escape this hell. For the fallen, for Earth, for humanity, they had to, or they would die trying, and take as many of the Malon bastards with them as they could. But for now, they could only endure. Samuel slumped against the wall, every nerve on fire, his breathing short and wet. He stared into the darkness, and in the darkness he stoked the embers of his rage. As the hours dragged into days and the torture continued without end, a flicker of hope emerged from an unlikely source. A young Malon guard named Zephyr was assigned to watch over the human prisoners. He lacked the sadistic streak of his comrades, and couldn't help but be impressed by the captives' sheer resilience in the face of such brutality. During a brief respite between interrogations, Samuel seized the opportunity to engage Zephyr in conversation through the force field of his cell. At first, the Malon was reluctant, but Samuel's natural charisma began to win him over. Zephyr confessed his growing disillusionment with the cruelty of the Empire's methods. He dreamed of a different path, one not drenched in the blood of innocence. Over the next few days, Samuel worked tirelessly to build a rapport with their unlikely ally. He used every ounce of his strength to stay conscious and lucid when Zephyr was on duty, speaking to him in low tones, painting a picture of a future where Zephyr could make a real difference by helping them escape. It was a dangerous gambit, and Samuel knew it could easily backfire, but with his men growing weaker by the day, it was a risk he had to take. To Samuel's surprise and cautious relief, Zephyr agreed to aid in their escape. "I'll help you," the young Malon said, his voice trembling slightly. "But you'll only have one shot at this. If we're caught—" He shuddered. "They'll make you beg for the mercy of death." Late one night, when the ship was in its sleep cycle and the corridors were nearly deserted, Zephyr made his move. The energy barrier on the cell flickered and died as he keyed in the override code. He slipped through the opening, pressing a bundle into Samuel's hands. "Weapons from the armory," he whispered. "Not much, but it's all I could get without raising suspicion." Samuel unwrapped the bundle with shaking fingers, revealing a handful of plasma pistols and stun batons. He distributed them among his men, watching as they checked the charges with grim determination. "The hangar bay," Zephyr said urgently. "There are a few small fighters docked there. It's your best chance." Samuel nodded, his heart pounding. He knew the odds of actually escaping the massive Malon battleship were vanishingly slim, but they had to try. He met each of his men's eyes in turn, seeing his own resolve reflected back at him. They were ready. With a deep breath, Samuel led the way out of the cell, Zephyr close behind. They moved swiftly through the corridors, the hum of the ship's engines masking their footsteps. But their luck couldn't hold forever. As they rounded a corner, alarms began to blare, the lights shifting to a pulsing red. Shouts echoed from nearby passages as the Malon crew began to stir. Samuel cursed under his breath, urging his men to move faster. Ahead, a group of armed Malon soldiers burst into view, weapons raised. Samuel and his squad opened fire, the air filling with the sizzle of plasma bolts and the smell of burnt metal. They pushed forward, stepping over the fallen bodies of their captors. And then Samuel found himself face to face with Corvus. The Malon commander stood at the other end of the corridor, a plasma rifle in his hands and a snarl on his face. Time seemed to slow as they stared each other down, fingers tense on triggers. In that frozen moment, Samuel knew with cold certainty that only one of them would be walking away from this confrontation. Samuel squeezed the trigger of his plasma pistol. The blazing bolt struck Corvus in the shoulder, spinning the Malon around. Corvus fired back, his shot scorching the wall by Samuel's head. The two crashed together, trading blows. Corvus moved with blinding speed, talons slashing. But Samuel was stronger, a lifetime of training guiding his strikes. They grappled, slamming into walls. Corvus hissed in Samuel's face, fetid breath washing over him. "You'll never escape," Corvus spat. "The Malon Empire will hunt you forever." Samuel's fist crunched into Corvus's ribs. "I'll take my chances." He smashed his forehead into Corvus's beak. Bone cracked. Corvus staggered back, dazed. Samuel broke free and sprinted for the hangar bay. Plasma fire chased him, his squad holding the door, returning shots. At the threshold, searing pain exploded in Samuel's leg. He fell to one knee. Corvus bore down on him, battered but still lethal, aiming at Samuel's head. A fierce battle cry. Zephyr appeared, tackling Corvus. The two Malons went down in a tangle of thrashing limbs and gnashing teeth. "Go," Zephyr yelled, grappling with Corvus. "Get out of here." Anguish ripped through Samuel. He met Zephyr's eyes a final time. Then he lurched to his feet and staggered to the waiting fighter. Alarms wailed as the ship blasted out of the hangar. AA batteries lit up the void with deadly fire. Samuel wrenched the controls, the world spinning, pain lancing up his ruined leg. The fighter streaked into open space, engines straining. The Malon ship disgorged a swarm of drones racing after them with murderous intent. Samuel gripped the stick, jaw clenched. They weren't safe yet, not even close. But they were free, they had a chance. And Samuel would fly this ship until it broke apart around him to reach Earth, to warn them. To make the Malon pay for every scream, every drop of blood, even if it killed him. The void erupted in a blistering storm of plasma as the Malon drones swarmed after the fleeing human fighter. Samuel wrenched the controls, sending the craft into a dizzying roll. Bolts of superheated gas crackled past, barely missing them. "Hold on!" Samuel yelled over the shriek of straining engines. His squadmates, strapped into the seats behind him, gripped their harnesses with white-knuckled intensity. The human ship shuddered as a plasma bolt clipped its wing. Warning lights flashed red, and sparks burst from overloading consoles. Smoke filled the cockpit, acrid and choking. Through the forward viewport, a dense field of asteroids tumbled into view, jagged and unforgiving. Samuel's eyes narrowed. A crazy, desperate idea formed. "I'm taking us in," he said grimly. "Into the asteroids?" one of his men shouted. "That's suicide." "If we stay out here, we're dead anyway," Samuel snapped back. "Those rocks might buy us a fighting chance." He gunned the throttle, aiming the fighter straight at the deadly obstacle course of space debris. The ship shook violently as it plunged into the field, the hull scraping and clanging against the tumbling boulders. Samuel's hands flew over the controls, making minute adjustments as he navigated the treacherous maze. Jagged stone filled the view screen, mere meters away. One wrong twitch, one miscalculation, and they'd be smashed to atoms. Behind them, the Malon drones tried to follow, but the nimble war machines, so deadly in open space, were ill-suited for the asteroid field's tight confines. One by one, they slammed into the unforgiving rocks, exploding in blinding flashes of vaporized metal. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually make it. Then a stray plasma bolt found its mark, tearing into the fighter's engine. Alarms shrieked as the craft lurched, spiraling out of control. "We're hit," Samuel shouted, fighting with the stick. "Brace for impact." The crippled ship plummeted, trailing smoke headed straight for a barren, rocky moon. Samuel gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of skill into pulling them out of the dive. At the last possible second, the fighter leveled out, skidding along the moon's surface in a shower of sparks and torn metal. It ground to a halt, half buried in a drift of grey dust. Silence fell, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the hiss of leaking atmo. Then slowly the cockpit canopy cracked open. Samuel and his men stumbled out, battered and bleeding, but still breathing. They gathered around the wrecked fighter, taking stock. The ship was a ruin, its engines slagged, its comms fried. They had only the weapons and supplies they could salvage, and no way to call for help. Samuel looked up at the star-filled sky, his breath misting in the thin, cold air. For a moment he let himself feel the weight of their desperate situation. Then he straightened, squaring his shoulders. "Check your weapons and gear," he ordered hoarsely. "Scavenge whatever you can from the—" He broke off as a new sound reached his ears, the roar of engines. On the horizon, a cluster of shapes descended from orbit, growing larger by the second. Malon landing craft, heavily armed and armored. As the ships touched down in a spray of dust and exhaust, ramps lowered and figures emerged. Dozens of Malon soldiers, bristling with weapons, and at their head, a tall avian form, his eyes glinting with malice, Corvus. Impossible, Samuel thought numbly. He'd seen the Malon commander tackled by Zephyr, buried under a tide of his own troops, but somehow he'd survived, and now he was here, on this desolate rock, ready to finish what he'd started. "Defensive positions," Samuel barked. "Move!" The humans scrambled for the cover of the nearby rocky outcroppings as the Malon troops fanned out, advancing on their position with ruthless efficiency. Samuel crouched behind a boulder, his salvaged plasma rifle gripped tight. Around him his squadmates took up firing positions, their faces grim and set. This was it, Samuel knew. No more running, no more cleverness or tricks, just a brutal, bloody last stand light years from home. He looked at his men, meeting each of their eyes in turn. No words were needed. They were soldiers, brothers. They would fight to the last breath. Samuel leaned out from cover and centered his sights on the lead Malon trooper. He breathed out, his finger tightening on the trigger. The battle for the nameless moon began. The air sizzled and cracked with the exchange of gunfire and plasma bolts as Samuel and his squad battled the Malon forces on the rocky, desolate moon. Ducking behind boulders and outcroppings, the humans used the jagged terrain to their advantage, ambushing the advancing Malons from concealed positions. Samuel lined up a shot, his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he dropped a charging Malon soldier. But for every enemy that fell, it seemed two more surged forward, heedless of their fallen comrades. "Running low," one of Samuel's men shouted, slamming his last magazine into his rifle. Samuel gritted his teeth. They couldn't hold out much longer. The Malons were closing in, their superior numbers and firepower inexorably wearing down the humans' defenses. Then, through the swirling dust and smoke, Samuel spotted a tall avian figure on a nearby ridgeline, barking orders to the Malon troops. Corvus. The hated Malon commander was directing the assault personally, safely out of range of the humans' weapons. An idea sparked in Samuel's mind, reckless and desperate. If they could take out Corvus, it might throw the Malons into disarray, buying them precious time. "Cover me!" Samuel yelled to his squad. "Keep their heads down." Without waiting for a response, he broke from cover and sprinted towards the ridgeline, zigzagging to avoid the plasma bolts that filled the air around him. His men laid down a blistering barrage of suppressing fire, the staccato of assault rifles echoing off the rocks. Samuel scrambled up the slope, his breath ragged in his helmet. His leg wound, sending jolts of agony through his body with every step. He was closing in on Corvus. The Malon commander's back turned to him. Suddenly a plasma bolt seared past Samuel's face, missing him by inches. His head snapped around there. Crouched among the rocks was a Malon sniper, taking aim for another shot. Samuel hurled himself to the ground as a second bolt scorched the air above him. He rolled behind a boulder, fumbling for his rifle. The sniper fired again, the plasma bolt exploding against the rock in a shower of molten fragments. Ignoring the searing pain in his arm where a shard of superheated stone had grazed him, Samuel popped up from cover and fired, his aim true. The sniper tumbled back, a neat hole punched through his helmet. But the damage was done. Samuel's position was compromised, and Corvus had turned to face him, a cruel, mocking smile on his beaked face. "Pathetic," the Malon commander sneered. "Did you really think you could sneak up on me, human? Your resistance is futile. Soon you'll be back in our custody, and you will pay dearly for this insurrection." Samuel rose to his feet, his blood pounding in his ears. His vision narrowed to Corvus's hated face. The Malan's words ignited a firestorm of rage in his chest, memories of the torture, the degradation, the friends lost fueling the inferno. With a howl of primal fury, Samuel charged at Corvus, plasma bolts filling the air around him as the Malan troops opened fire. He jinked and weaved, his movements almost too fast to follow, closing the distance to his tormentor. It was a foolhardy move, driven more by emotion than tactical sense. But in that moment, Samuel didn't care. All he could think about was wiping that smug grin off Corvus's face once and for all. With a howl of primal fury, Samuel crashed into Corvus, slamming his fist into the Malan's face. Corvus reeled back but quickly regained his footing, lashing out with his razor-sharp talons. The two adversaries traded blows, their armored suits sparking and denting under the relentless impacts. Corvus moved with blinding speed, his avian reflexes giving him an edge. His talons raked across Samuel's chest, shredding through layers of ceramic plate. But Samuel fought back with brute force, his genetically enhanced muscles driving his fists into Corvus's torso again and again. The Malan commander's bodyguards surged forward, plasma rifles raised, but a hail of gunfire from Samuel's squad forced them back into cover, the air crackling with deadly energy. Locked in a brutal clinch, Samuel and Corvus tumbled down the rocky slope, bouncing and rolling in a tangle of thrashing limbs. They hit the ground at the base of the ridge in a cloud of dust, the impact stunning them both for a moment. Samuel shook off the daze first. His hand closed around a jagged shard of stone, and he drove it deep into Corvus's thigh, twisting viciously. The Malan screeched in agony, his leg buckling, but the pain only seemed to enrage him further. With a burst of ferocious strength, Corvus threw Samuel off him and pounced, pinning the human to the ground. His talons closed around Samuel's throat, squeezing with crushing force. Samuel choked and gasped, black spots swimming in his vision as he struggled desperately to break free. But Corvus's grip was implacable, his eyes blazing with sadistic glee as he watched the life drain from Samuel's face. "Die, human filth," Corvus hissed through his shattered beak. "Die knowing your homeworld will burn." Darkness crept in at the edges of Samuel's sight. His lungs screamed for air. But then, from some hidden well of strength, one last surge of defiance rose up within him. With a wordless snarl, Samuel wrenched one of Corvus's hands away from his throat. Before the Malan could react, Samuel reared up and slammed his forehead into Corvus's face with every ounce of force he could muster. Bone crunched and splintered. Corvus reeled back, shrieking, his hands flying up to clutch at the ruin of his beak. Samuel sucked in a great ragged gasp of air and surged to his feet. He crashed into Corvus, bearing him to the ground in a furious tackle. Straddling the Malan's chest, Samuel rained down a savage flurry of blows, his armored fists rising and falling like pistons. All the pain, all the rage, all the grief he'd been forced to endure poured out of him, focused into each crunching impact. He pounded Corvus's face into an unrecognizable pulp, and still he didn't stop, even as his arms burned with fatigue and his knuckles split inside his gloves. Only when the Malan's struggles ceased entirely, his body going limp, did Samuel finally relent. Breathing hard, Samuel staggered to his feet, barely registering the sticky blue blood coating his hands. He looked around, blinking sweat and alien dust from his eyes. The Malans were falling back, their formation crumbling as they watched their commander fall. Samuel's squad, bloody and battered but still standing, let out ragged cheers of triumph. But Samuel's grim satisfaction was short-lived. In the distance, he could hear the throaty roar of engines growing louder. Malan reinforcements, no doubt summoned by Corvus before the battle. They'd be upon them in minutes, and this time, the humans wouldn't stand a chance. "We need to move," Samuel yelled, his voice raw. "Find us a way out of here now." His men scrambled, searching desperately for anything that could serve as an escape craft. But the Malan landers were too well guarded, the terrain too exposed. It seemed hopeless. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Samuel caught a flicker of movement near one of the grounded Malone ships, a figure waving frantically at them. Samuel squinted, hardly daring to believe it, but there was no mistaking that lean avian frame. It was Zephyr, their unlikely ally. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived, and from the looks of it, he'd just secured them away off this rock. Samuel felt a wild surge of hope rise up in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they would make it out of this after all. Samuel and his men sprinted across the cratered moonscape, their boots kicking up sprays of dust as plasma bolts sizzled through the thin atmosphere around them. Ahead, Zephyr waved frantically from the open hatch of the Malone landing craft, his avian features taut with urgency. "Move, move!" Samuel shouted, his voice ragged. His lungs burned and his injured leg threatened to buckle with each stride, but he pushed through the pain, driven by the primal need to escape. They reached the craft and scrambled aboard, plasma scorching the hull mere inches from their heads. Samuel hauled himself into the cockpit beside Zephyr as his men sealed the hatch. "Hang on!" Zephyr yelled, his talons flying over the controls. The engines roared to life and the craft surged forward, pressed them back into their seats. As they rocketed away from the moon's surface, Zephyr recounted his narrow escape from the Malone ship, amidst the chaos of the humans' breakout. "Slipped away in the confusion, found my way to the hangar," he said breathlessly. "Took a chance you'd need a ride." Samuel clasped the Malone's shoulder. "Glad you did, we owe you one." But his gratitude was cut short as they burst from the moon's orbit straight into a maelstrom of destruction. Malone warships and lean, predatory Earth vessels tore into each other, the void alight with searing energy beams and the silent explosions of ruptured hulls. "Hell yes," one of Samuel's men crowed. "The cavalry's here." Samuel watched in awe as the Earth ships carved through the Malone fleet with ruthless efficiency. "They got my warning," he said, his heart surging with fierce pride. But their jubilation was short-lived. The Malone ships, recognizing the captured landing craft, opened fire. The small vessel shuddered as plasma slammed into its shields. "We're not out of this yet," Samuel growled. He keyed the comms, hailing the Earth fleet. "This is Captain Samuel Miller, authentication code Alpha Zulu 9er. Hold your fire. We're on your side." A heartbeat passed. 2. The landing craft's shields flickered on the verge of collapse. Samuel held his breath, praying. The comms crackled. "Captain Miller, this is Admiral Hawkins. Damn good to hear your voice, son. Dock in our hangar. But no funny business or we'll vaporize you." Samuel sagged in relief. "Copy that, Admiral. Coming in." Zephyr coaxed the battered craft towards the yawning hangar of the Earth battleship, dodging the crisscrossing fighter squadrons and sizzling energy beams. The vessel shuddered as tractor beams locked on, guiding them in. The landing was rough, the craft skidding across the hangar deck in a shower of sparks. As the hatch hissed open, Samuel and his men found themselves staring down the barrels of a dozen assault rifles held by grim-faced Earth Marines. Admiral Hawkins shouldered his way past the cordon, his face a mix of relief and steely resolve. He clasped Samuel's hand in a crushing grip. "Hell of a thing you did, Captain. Hell of a thing." Samuel met his eyes. "We're not done yet, sir. I've got intel we need to—" Hawkins held up a hand. "In due time. For now, get your men to medical. We're just getting started with these Malone bastards, and we'll need every able body." He glanced at Zephyr, his expression hardening. "And you? We'll figure out what to do with you later." As medics swarmed in to tend to the wounded humans, and Marines herded a wary Zephyr away for questioning, Samuel limped to the hangar viewports. Beyond the reinforced glass, the battle raged on in all its terrible glory, the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. They'd escaped the Malone's clutches. They'd made it home. But Samuel knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. In the command center of the Earth battleship, Samuel stood before a holographic display, his battered face grim as he gestured to the rotating schematic of a Malone warship. Zephyr stood beside him, the Malone defector looking out of place among the Earth officers. Their primary weapons are concentrated here, here, and here, Samuel said, jabbing a finger at the glowing weak points. Corvus favors a swift, aggressive first strike to overwhelm the enemy. He'll try to close the distance and target our command ship. Admiral Hawkins nodded, his eyes hard as he studied the display. Around him, his staff typed furiously at their consoles, transmitting the intel to the fleet. And their defenses? Heavily shielded but not invulnerable, Zephyr chimed in. Sustained fire from your railguns should be able to punch through, given enough time. The deck shuddered beneath their feet as the Earthships opened fire, their massive cannons hurling shells across the void. On the view screens, the Malon fleet responded in kind, plasma bolts and missiles crisscrossing the starfield. But armed with Samuel and Zephyr's inside knowledge, the Earthships began to gain the upper hand. They concentrated their fire on the Malon weak points, whittling down their shields, blasting holes in their armor. One by one, the alien warships began to fall, exploding into clouds of debris. A cheer went up from the bridge crew as a particularly large Malon vessel broke apart under the Earth fleet's onslaught. Samuel allowed himself a small, grim smile. They were turning the tide. But the celebration was short-lived. A proximity alarm blared, red lights pulsing. On the main view screen, the Malon flagship loomed, its hull pitted and scarred from the battle, and from its underside, a massive cannon emerged, glowing with a sickly, pulsating light. Zephyr paled, his eyes wide. "No," he whispered, "they can't, not here." "What is it?" Admiral Hawkins demanded. "What are we looking at?" "The Zephyrium cannon," Zephyr said, his voice trembling. "A planet killer. It fires a concentrated beam of Zephyrium particles. Nothing can withstand it." Admiral Hawkins swore under his breath. "If they fire that thing here—" "It'll wipe out both fleets," Samuel finished grimly, "and everything else in the system." For a moment, silence fell over the command center, the weight of the realization sinking in. Then Admiral Hawkins straightened, his jaw set. "We can't let that happen," he said. "We need to take out that cannon before they have a chance to fire." "Sir, a direct assault on the flagship would be suicide," one of the officers protested. "Agreed," Hawkins said. "That's why we're not going to assault it directly." He turned to Samuel and Zephyr. "You two know that ship better than anyone. If we could get a small team aboard, could you get to the cannon's control systems? Sabotage it from the inside?" Samuel and Zephyr exchanged a glance. They both knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but what choice did they have? "We can do it," Samuel said, his voice steady. "Give us a squad of your best and a way in. We'll handle the rest." Admiral Hawkins nodded. "Done." He turned to his staff. "Prep a stealth shuttle and assemble a strike team. Volunteers only." He turned back to Samuel. "One more thing." He pressed a small, innocuous-looking device into Samuel's hand. "Experimental tech from the labs. It emits a high-frequency pulse that should disrupt Malon systems. It's never been field-tested, but it's better than nothing," Samuel finished, tucking the device into his pocket. "Thank you, sir." Minutes later, Samuel and Zephyr stood in the hangar bay, a hand-picked team of Earth commandos at their back. They boarded the waiting stealth shuttle, its hull shimmering with active camouflage. As the shuttle rocketed away from the Earth ship, dodging and weaving through the chaos of the battle, Samuel felt a grim determination settle over him. This was it, their last chance. Failure was not an option. The shuttle glided into the Malon flagship's hangar, its cloak holding. They slipped out, weapons ready, moving swiftly and silently through the enemy ship. Zephyr led the way, his knowledge of the ship's layout guiding them through the twisting corridors. But as they neared the Zephyrium cannon's control room, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. Corvus. The Malon commander's face was a twisted mask of rage and hate, his wounds from their earlier battle still raw. "You," he hissed, his eyes locking on Samuel. "I knew you'd come." Samuel raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Around him his team fanned out, weapons trained on the Malon. Corvus, Samuel said, his voice cold. Get out of our way, you've lost. The Malon commander laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Lost? No human. This is only the beginning. When the Zephyrium cannon fires, your pathetic fleet will be nothing but atoms, and your homeworld will be next. Samuel's jaw clenched. He knew Corvus was stalling, trying to buy time for the cannon to charge. Every second counted. He glanced at Zephyr, saw his own determination mirrored in the Malon defector's eyes. They had to end this, now. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. Corvus tensed, ready to spring. The air crackled with tension, the fate of worlds hanging in the balance. Abruptly, plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Samuel and his team pushed forward, their weapons blazing. The prototype device pulsed in Samuel's hand, emitting a disruptive field that caused the Malon rifles to short out and explode. The elite guards fell back, their formation crumbling under the onslaught. But Corvus was relentless, surging through the chaos with murder in his eyes. He slammed into Samuel, talons slashing, beak snapping. They tumbled to the deck, grappling fiercely. You think you've won? Corvus snarled, slamming his fist into Samuel's face. The Malon Empire will crush your pathetic species. Earth will burn. Samuel headbutted Corvus, splitting the avian's brow. Not today. They rolled across the floor, exchanging vicious blows. Samuel's strength was fading, his injuries taking their toll. Corvus sensed his weakness, pressing his advantage. Samuel's fingers tightened on the prototype weapon. It was now or never. With a roar of effort, he activated the device and rammed it against Corvus's chest. The pulse was blinding. Corvus screamed, his body convulsing violently as the disruptive energy tore through him. He collapsed, twitching and frothing, his nervous system overloaded. Samuel staggered to his feet, breathing hard. Control room now. They sprinted through the ship, alarms blaring. In the control room, Zephyr's talons flew over the console, inputting the destruct sequence for the Zephyrium cannon. Done? Zephyr yelled. We have to go. But as they turned to leave, the door hissed open, revealing a sea of Malon soldiers, weapons aimed and ready. Samuel's heart sank. There were too many, even with the prototype weapon. He keyed his comm. Fall back to the shuttle, we'll hold them off. But, sir, one of his men protested. That's an order, go now. Zephyr locked eyes with Samuel. I'm staying. Samuel nodded grimly. There was no time to argue. As one, they raised their weapons and charged into the horde of Malons, firing non-stop. Plasma bolts filled the air, searing into flesh. Malon soldiers fell, but more surged forward. Samuel and Zephyr fought back to back, a whirlwind of desperate aggression. The ship shuddered violently as the cannon's self-destruct countdown hit 0. Explosions ripped through the hull, tearing bulkheads apart. The Malons scattered in panic. Samuel and Zephyr held their ground, pouring fire into the retreating aliens. Shockwaves slammed into them, throwing them off balance. Warning klaxons blared, drowning out the sounds of battle. Samuel, Zephyr shouted over the din, if we don't leave now, we never will. Samuel gritted his teeth. Then let's make it count. They surged forward, weapons blazing, cutting a path through the Malon troops. The ship bucked and heaved around them, explosions ripping through compartments. Beams crashed down from the ceiling, crushing Malon soldiers. Ahead, through a veil of smoke and fire, Samuel glimpsed the hangar bay. The shuttle was gone, escaped. His men had made it. A savage smile split his face. They'd done it. The cannon was destroyed. Earth was safe. He turned to Zephyr, a final remark on his lips. The world exploded in a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. The shockwave from the cannon's death throes slammed into the hangar bay, shattering the shuttle on its launch pad. Debris scythed through the air, razor-sharp and white-hot. Samuel felt a searing jolt of pain. He looked down to see a jagged shard of metal protruding from his chest, glinting crimson. More impacts pummeled his body, each a starburst of agony. He fell to his knees, his strength fleeing. Beside him, Zephyr crumpled, his avian features slack and still. Darkness crept in at the edges of Samuel's vision. He slumped to the deck, his blood pooling beneath him. The last thing he saw was the Malon flagship tearing itself apart, consumed by a brilliant cascade of explosions. A faint smile curved his lips. They'd won, Earth was safe, his mission was complete. As the light faded from his eyes and the cold embrace of oblivion whispered to him, Samuel's final thought was of home. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.